Before listening to this sermon, you should please read Job chapter 42. Job chapter 42. The title of this sermon is Suffering and Finality. Suffering and Finality. So we've reached our finale in the book of Job, and on a theological level we may think we have understood nothing. We leave the book of Job with more questions than answers. And the reason why God allowed Job's suffering, well, it still doesn't make sense. In one sense, we may think we have understood nothing. But in another sense, we understand every chapter and every verse. We all understand the pain of suffering. It is something we all can relate to. We all understand Job's sense of injustice. Why would God allow him to suffer? We all understand the anger that Job felt towards his three friends, people who had added to his suffering through their insensitive, critical and condemning words. We read in chapter 42 verse 7, "After the Lord had said these things to Job, he said to Eliphaz the Temanite, I am angry with you and your two friends, because you have not spoken the truth about me, as my servant Job has." In the finale of the book of Job, we learn that Job's anger towards his friends is justified. For God is also angry at Job's three friends and their ill-thought words. And with this in mind, I could really quite understand if the book of Job ended in the following way. After the Lord had said these things to Job, he said to Eliphaz the Temanite, I am angry with you and your two friends, because you have not spoken the truth about me, as my servant Job has. So now take 7 bulls and 7 rams, and go to my servant Job. Ask him to kill them, and offer them up to me as sacrifices for forgiveness. So Job's 3 friends went to Job with their 7 bulls and 7 rams. Job was penniless, having lost all his sheep, camels, oxen and donkeys. And so Job was glad to accept these animals from his friends as a gift. No, Job's friends replied. Stop being so self-centered. God says we've treated you unjustly, so here are the animals and here is the knife. Job took the knife, stabbed one friend in the back and chopped the head off the 2 others. Job then thinly sliced their bodies in order to feed their bodies to his 7 rams and 7 cows. The food from those 14 animals kept Job going for the next 3 years. Now, in one sense, such an alternative ending to the book of Job might seem shocking. But in another sense, it's not really that shocking at all. Throughout chapters 1 to 41, we felt Job's pain. We felt Job's sense of injustice, and we felt Job's just anger towards his 3 friends. If we were Job, this is the type of strict justice we would demand, chopping up their dead bodies and feeding them to some pigs. And yet, rather than treating his 3 friends according to the principle of strict justice, Job shows his 3 friends mercy and grace instead. But why? Why is grace and not strict justice? Why is grace so much a feature of this last chapter? Why is grace so much a feature when in the other 41 chapters have all been about debating the justice of God? Why? Well, when it comes to the problem of suffering, grace, not strict justice, is the solution. To explain why grace and not strict justice is the solution to the problem of suffering, we're going to have to go back to Job chapter 1. Verse 1 of chapter 1. In the land of Uz, there lived a man whose name was Job. This man was blameless and upright. He feared God and shunned evil. In chapter 1 of Job, we meet our innocent sufferer. Job is described as blameless and upright, fearing God and shunning evil. Question: name one other person in the world who could be described in the same way. Could you, I, or anyone else in the world be described as blameless and upright, always giving God the honour and glory he deserves, always shunning that which is wrong? Suffering entered the world because we don't live this kind of life. Suffering has entered this world because of human sin. Now don't get me wrong, this doesn't mean bad people suffer more than good people. The story of Job certainly proves that idea wrong. This doesn't mean the individual suffering is God's punishment for specific sin. The book of Job also proves that idea wrong as well. But Genesis 3 in the Bible is very clear that suffering in general has entered the world as a result of human sin. And though God takes no delight in suffering, and though much suffering in the world might seem unfair, it's important to remember that the answer to the problem of suffering is grace and not strict justice. For if God were to rule the world according to strict justice, then things would be a lot worse than they are now. In the land of Uz, here's the alternative ending again. In the land of Uz there lived a man whose name was Job. This man was blameless and upright. He feared God and shunned evil. His friends treated him badly, and so God chopped their bodies into pieces and fed their bodies to the animals on Job's farm. This is another alternative ending to the story of Job, based on the principle of strict justice. Now here is an alternative story of Jesus Christ. Again, a story based on strict justice and no grace. In the land of Nazareth, there lived a man whose name was Jesus. This man was God's son. Jesus was blameless and upright. He feared God and shunned evil. Despite being innocent, Jesus was treated badly. Jesus was denied by his friends, rejected by the religious, and condemned to death by the rest of the world. How did God react to the sin against his one and only Son? By chopping up their bodies and feeding their bodies to the pigs. And since everyone else in the world had sinned against God, God condemned the world to a similar fate. If God ruled the world this way, if God ruled the world according to strict justice alone, that would be a very terrifying prospect indeed. Neither you nor I could be described as blameless and upright. Neither you or I could be described as always giving God the honour and glory he deserves. Neither you or I always shun that which is evil and that which is wrong. And for that reason, I am very glad that the book of Job ends with an emphasis on grace rather than an emphasis on strict justice alone. God ends the story of Job's suffering with Job, the innocent sufferer, praying for the forgiveness of his enemies and dealing with them in a gracious way. God's book that deals with the problem of suffering ends with an emphasis on grace. And God's other story, the story of Jesus, the other innocent sufferer, God's other story about Jesus places a similar emphasis on grace as well. In the land of Nazareth, there lived a man whose name was Jesus. This man was God's son. Jesus was blameless and upright. He feared God and shunned evil. Despite being innocent, Jesus was treated badly. Jesus was denied by his friends, rejected by the religious, and condemned to death by the rest of the world. How did Jesus react? Jesus asked for the forgiveness of his enemies and asked God to extend the same grace to the world. Why did God send his Son into the world of suffering? Why did God let his innocent Son suffer in ways that seem so unjust? Why did Jesus offer grace to his enemies? Why did Jesus extend this offer to every other sinner in the world? Why? Because God has chosen to answer our problem of suffering through grace. The grace offered to us through his one and only Son, Jesus Christ. through faith in the grace of God as offered us through Jesus. Through faith in this grace, you and I can have our sins forgiven and look forward to a world free of suffering. To all who put their faith in Christ, God promises to do away with the problem of suffering once and for all. The Christian faith is based on the following words. 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 18. Christ also suffered once for sins, the righteous for the unrighteous, to bring you to God. This is what the Christian faith is based on. God's gracious forgiveness towards those who are undeserving. And for this reason, the Christian hope is described in the following way. John, in a vision of the future, writes in chapter 21 of Revelation, "Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and there was no longer any sea. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, 'Look, God's dwelling place is now among the people, and he will dwell with them. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them, and be their God. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death, or mourning, or crying, or pain, for the old order of things has passed away.'" God has chosen to answer our problem of suffering through graciously doing away with suffering once and for all. This offer of future relief is made to all who put their faith in God's Son, Jesus Christ, the innocent sufferer who prays for his enemies and offers them God's grace. And secondly, patience and faith. Patience and faith. From chapters 3 to 31, Job has been defending his integrity. He's been clinging on to the hope that God would act justly and intervene. And yet, Job's restoration comes after he admits his error to God and after he repents. Even Job's restoration comes after Job looks to God for grace. And after looking to God for grace himself, and after showing grace towards his three friends, Job's fortune is restored. Verse 12 of chapter 42. After Job had prayed for his friends, the Lord restored his fortunes and gave him twice as much as he had before. After Job looks to God for grace, Job's fortunes are restored. So the answer to our problem of suffering is simple, we think. We look to God to graciously do away with suffering, something that happened to Job in his lifetime, but something that will only happen to the believer when Christ comes again. We look to God to graciously do away with suffering, and that fact immediately causes the problem of suffering to go away. I'd like you to take note. The problem of suffering does not go away when someone becomes a believer. Christians still suffer. And the fact that God promises to relieve Christians of all their suffering in the future does not necessarily make the problem of suffering easy to bear. Just because God promises future relief doesn't necessarily mean it's easy to suffer in the here and now. The fact that Job prospered twice as much after his suffering did not mean it was ungodly for him to grieve over what he lost. The fact that Job went on to have 7 more children did not make the death of his other 7 children any easier. The fact that Job went on to enjoy a prosperous life for 140 more years did not mean his long time of suffering earlier was easy. In the same way, just because God promises Christians eternal future relief from suffering does not mean suffering in this life is an easy ride. It certainly helps us undergo suffering, looking forward to the future, but it doesn't necessarily mean suffering is any easier in the here and now. Things like bereavement, unemployment, chronic illness are all still painful and still testing of a person's faith. they certainly were a test to Job's faith. That's why after the first mention of God's restoration of Job, we have God's earthly acknowledgement of just how painful it was. All his brothers and sisters and everyone who had known him before came and ate with him in his house. They comforted and consoled him over all the trouble the Lord had brought on him, and each one gave him a piece of silver and a gold ring. Throughout the book of Job, Job has been asking for comfort. The comfort of friends who would listen. The comfort of having his pain acknowledged. The comfort of knowing that God would act to bring about his relief. And so part of God's comfort towards Job was to provide friends who would acknowledge just how painful Job's losses were, as well as being a practical help. As we saw last week, you and I are called to be that God-given comfort to other people, not by solving all the problems of those who suffer, but by listening and acknowledging other people's pain. Though it's worth noting that Job's friends also sought to be a practical help as well. They gave him a bit of silver and a bit of gold, which would certainly help Job in the long term. Job's cry for comfort was answered by God. And it was also God's answer to Job's question, does God actually care? Job, these friends were God's answer to Job's question, does God actually care? If you ever find yourself asking that question, does God actually care? Remember that Job also asked that question, and he had to wait a long time for the answer. He had to persevere in his belief that God cared during times when his circumstances would seem to contradict the idea that God cared. But eventually he learned, through the comfort and consolation of his friends and the restoration God provided him with in the future, eventually Job learned that God cared more than he previously realized. So 2 New Testament reminders to us that God cares. 2 New Testament reminders to us that God cares include, firstly, Jesus. Jesus was sent into this world because God cared. Jesus wept and mourned with people because God cared. Jesus died on a cross because God cared. One proof that God cares about our suffering is Jesus Christ. A second proof, well, God seems to pay a lot of attention to tears. In Psalm 56, God is said to keep track of his people's tears in a bottle. Not even a single tear falls to the ground without God noticing. In the future, Revelation 21 declares that God will personally wipe away every tear from his people's eyes. Though the promise of full and final relief from suffering is wonderful, we need to persist in faith that God cares as we wait. Like Job, we need to persevere in the belief that God cares even during times when our circumstances would seem to contradict it, as well as remembering to be a practical demonstration of God's care to other people. Like Job, we need patience and faith. We need patience and faith. We read in verse 12 of chapter 42. The Lord blessed the latter part of Job's life more than the former part. He had 14,000 sheep, 6,000 camels, 1,000 yoke of oxen, and 1,000 donkeys. And he also had 7 sons and 3 daughters. The first daughter he named Jemimah, the second Keziah, and the third Keren-Happuch. Nowhere in all the land were there found women as beautiful as Job's daughters, and their father granted them an inheritance along with their brothers. After this Job lived 140 years. He saw his children and their children to the 4th generation, and so Job died, an old man and full of years. So how many seconds did it take to read those 5 verses about Job's restoration? Well, probably less than 15 seconds. But how many years did it take this restoration to take place? How many years did it take Job to go from having no kids to having 7? How many decades did it take for Job to go from having no farm animals to having over 20,000? Even if Job and his wife had no break between having children, it would have taken them over 5 years. And having to raise 5 under 5s at the same time could hardly be described as heaven on earth. Not forgetting having to run a growing farming business at the same time. As with the rest of Job's life, Job had to demonstrate faith and patience. Faith and patience. God spoke of restoration in verse 12, but there was a lot of waiting before restoration took place. It's for these reasons the book of James in the New Testament speaks of our need to have the same patience as Job. In James chapter 5 verse 7, be patient then, brothers and sisters, until the Lord's coming. The Lord's coming, just so you know, it just is the time when God will end all suffering once and for all, when Jesus Christ comes again. Be patient, James writes. Be patient then, brothers and sisters, until the Lord's coming. See how the farmer waits for the land to yield its valuable crop, patiently waiting for the autumn and spring rains. You too, be patient and stand firm, because the Lord's coming is near. Brothers and sisters, as an example of patience in the face of suffering, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. As you know, we count blessed those who have persevered. You have heard of Job's perseverance, and have seen what the Lord finally brought about. The Lord is full of compassion and mercy. As Christian believers, we need to have faith, patience, and perseverance. Believing God is compassionate and merciful, trusting His promise of future relief, persevering in faith during the months, years, and potentially decades when such relief seems very far away. The last chapter in the book of Job reminds us of God's mercy and God's faithfulness, and our need to be patient till God's mercy and God's faithfulness are fully and finally revealed.